This is an interview conducted by Helen Ingram and Wendy Gwynn Laird Benner of Jennifer Pitt in 2010. I think we're very interested in networks and how they work, and I'm particularly interested because I listened to a presentation that Margaret Wilder gave in Irvine, and she talked about you and the way in which some of the ideas for the Upper Gulf evidently developed or came to fruition while you were on a river trip. If that's true or not true, I'd like you to let me know. But I'm also, we have talked to Carl Flessa and Luther Probst and others, and they talk about this very unusual alliance of players that were put together here. And while most of the people we've talked about are part of sort of a self-identified group of people in the Sonoran Desert and Upper Gulf, we've never included people who were so far afield as the Bureau of Reclamation and the Salt River Project, and I know they're part of your network, and I'm just sort of interested in how that happened.
So part of it is about the notion that networks are long-standing, cohesive, and can serve a function in preservation, conservation, the natural resources, and that the border, the U.S. Mexico border itself, has various challenges. And so how do these networks deal with the challenges of the U.S. Mexico border and the Upper Gulf and the Pinacate area? So we're also interested in, are the resources better off now, and how are the networks working? Who do you see as part of those networks? Institutions versus people, those kinds of questions. And we've got, I think we sent you that document with some sort of a structure or framework for questions. But it's a pretty open-ended process that we've been doing.
Okay, sounds good. Can you, maybe just one clarifying question to start. When you're talking about networks, I could listen to you and think you're asking me about the NGOs or the other folks who consider themselves as having a job description that's about conservation of natural resources, or I could define networks as people and institutions that do things that bear on those resources, that are, have an impact on those resources and are therefore relevant to the future of those resources. So I'm wondering if you understood my distinction, which one you're talking about.
Yes, I think what we are interested in is the conservation network, because part of what we're maintaining here is that these long-standing ties, which sometimes go back 30 years, are able to withstand changes in subject matter and also good and bad times, and we're particularly interested in how they've been able to sustain themselves in a time when the discourse on the border has been so negative. And one of the things that's really interesting about the Upper Gulf is, as I understand it, we're even talking about coming to an agreement to send water across the border, at least paper water across the border, and that's for conservation purposes, and that's pretty unprecedented. And it seems an interesting time for this to happen, and how that came about is really, I think, pretty important. And it's not as if we haven't included people. I mean, we've talked to people in the Goldwater gunnery range, for example, who talked to people in the military. We've talked to park superintendents who spend a lot of time with the Border Patrol. So we're interested in those conversations, but more than anything, we're interested in how the group of environmental and conservation people have talked together to be successful.
Okay.
So with your permission, we'll record this?
That's fine.
Okay. So Helen, can you do that?
Yeah, yes, I will. And Jennifer, why don't we talk a little bit by beginning with your history just a little bit. Unfortunately, I've never had the pleasure of meeting you, although I know Wendy has, and I'm just, I'd like to know sort of how you got into this business, how long you've been involved in it, and how this interest in the Colorado River and the Upper Gulf emerged.
Sure. Well, I would say that my interest in the Colorado River and the Upper Gulf really is about having gotten this job with Environmental Defense Fund, which I've now had for more than 10 years, maybe 11 plus years at this point. And I was hired specifically to work on restoration and protection in the Colorado River Delta. Environmental Defense Fund's interest really had been basin-wide management of water in the Colorado River Basin, and had someone working on the Delta who left, and so I was hired to play that role. And I came actually from the East Coast at that point, where I'd been working for a little program in the National Park Service that provides technical assistance to community groups working on river restoration and river access issues. So I had some experience in multi-stakeholder projects, and particularly in the context of river management and river restoration. So I think that's what made me a good candidate for the job, but I really didn't know very much about the Colorado River when I first came out here. And while I had worked years before that as a park ranger at Mesa Verde, so I wasn't entirely a stranger to the Intermountain West. I really am an East Coast person by birth. I was born in Massachusetts and raised in New York, so I kind of landed here a little serendipitously. But it's just, from day one, it's been a fascinating, challenging, stimulating project to work on, and I've been very fortunate in having some great colleagues at other organizations to work with and to learn from, and to gain experience alongside them. And I think we have really evolved over the last decade, and because of some of the consistency of people working on the issues over that long period of time, we've been able to get a little better at what we're doing.
Might you just identify a few of those people, or at least the organizations, for us?
Sure. No, and I'll tell you specific people.
Good.
So, Osvaldo Hinojosa at Pronatura Noroeste. I first knew him when he was finishing his PhD at U of A as an ornithologist, and he used to say to me, "You do all those meetings to talk about water. I just want to go look at the birds." He now is really a partner in thinking through water management, political strategies, policy issues, and really is a tremendous conservation professional, and just a fantastic partner to work with. His significant other is Yamilet Carrillo, and she also is a Pronatura employee. She's a recent grad with her PhD from U of A, and so she was sort of less visible to me for a few years while she was in the thick of working on her degree, but has really emerged from that as someone with a great perspective on water management in Mexico and Mexicali Valley, and another person who's just a pleasure to work with. Since about 2005 or 2006, I can't remember, we have worked with Carlos de la Parra, who's now a professor at COLES in Tijuana. I first met him when he was a Semirnat representative at the Mexican embassy in D.C. I first met him, I can't remember what his job was, but he actually had ties to EDF from when he was getting his PhD at Michigan, because he worked with my former boss here on a wastewater treatment project and water reuse project in Tijuana called Ecoparque. So that's how I met Carlos. Then we found him again at the embassy in D.C., and when he left the embassy, we started working with him directly as a consultant to Environmental Defense Fund. And so he just has tremendous ties to leadership at SILA, at Semirnat broadly, at Conagua, throughout academia and is very interested. He's a Tijuana native. He's brilliant. He's a great writer, and he's just an invaluable resource to us, particularly in understanding what's happening at very high levels of government in Mexico. So I'd say, and then Peter Culp, who, when I first met him, was a law student at University of Arizona, and now is a partner at Squire, Sanders and Dempsey, and is through his firm works both as a paid and pro bono advisor to the Nature Conservancy on the binational negotiations, and is just knows a tremendous amount about Colorado River management, about Colorado River water users, stakeholder interests, politics, etc., and has just been a tremendous colleague to have in that respect. So I would say those are principally, that's the sort of core group I've worked with.
That's very helpful. Can you tell me...
At least over the last 5 years. It's changed over time. I've sort of done different things, different people, but in the last 5 years, I'd say that's really the core group I've worked with.
Good, that's very helpful. Now, can you talk a little bit about how your thinking on this has evolved and how this very interesting proposal emerged?
And you're talking specifically about delivering water to the Delta.
Yeah, exactly.
Binational agreement to deliver water to the Delta. Well, when I first took this job, I was basically told, here, we've done a little research. You have to write this report on the Colorado River Delta, and there are some guys at U of A and in Mexico who've done a little bit of work to begin to get a rough idea of how to quantify how much water the Delta needs. So my first job was to just throw myself into it and get that report out. But I would say that at the time, and this is 99, when I went to venues where I was able to speak with either government or water user stakeholders of the Colorado River, it was hard to bring up the subject of flows for the Colorado River Delta without being just dismissed as, crazy, dreaming environmentalists.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, first we had to do a big job of defining what it was about the Delta that we thought was worth protecting and or restoring. We had to define it in a way that seemed doable. We had to present the case for why it was of value, particularly in the context of the rest of the, at least the lower river basin. And so there was a big report that we published, and that was a collaboration between a number of NGOs, including many of the folks I'd mentioned, maybe not everyone, but many others as well. And Sonoran Institute played a key role in that as well back in the days when Steve Cornelius was there. He's for years been at MacArthur Foundation. So we brought together the conservation community that had people with an interest and a knowledge about the Delta ecosystems, and we also brought in some key water manager / water user stakeholders from the U.S. and from Mexico as a way, and we brought them in, I think we called them at the time observers, and this was a way to make sure that our process was viewed as credible and transparent, and that we weren't just going off in a room, by ourselves to gin up some picture of the ecological values in the Delta, but did it in a sort of workshop, in an open workshop setting. And that took place, I think, in 2002, and the report probably didn't get published until 2004 or 2005. It's called Conservation Priorities in the Colorado River Delta, United States and Mexico, or something like that.
That's what it's called.
And that report, sorry?
The Conservation Priorities is what it's called.
Yeah, Conservation Priorities in the Colorado River Delta.
Okay.
And it, that really helped to spell out the doability of what we were talking about, the feasibility of restoring flows to the delta. And at the same time, we're defining flows as that the flow needs as something like 1% or 2% of the river's annual average flow. So we began to make it clear to the broader set of stakeholders in the Colorado River that we weren't talking about taking down dams and restoring landscapes to pre-development conditions, but actually had a very modest set of goals in mind that we thought could, provide a big bang for the buck in terms of habitat, the potential for creating habitat. And so I think that was a key step.
Okay.
Going from sort of rhetoric about restoration to quantifying and defining and drawing lines on maps and making it a little bit easier to understand and defining a project with a modest scope. In that same time frame that we were working on that, Defenders of Wildlife brought litigation concerning endangered species and flows on the main stem. In that, the courts found essentially they did not find for the plaintiff, and essentially said that the treaty between the United States and Mexico trumps the Endangered Species Act on the main stem of the Colorado River. It was sort of a narrowly, I'm not an attorney, so I can't explain the decision to you well, but it basically had to do with particular species that had been named in the suit. And so we thought that it was a pretty narrow decision, and yet it did seem like it took the fire out of the arguments that you could litigate a solution to river flows on the Colorado for the Delta. And it became, very clear at that point that any solution to providing those flows was going to have to be acceptable to the river stakeholders, all the river stakeholders essentially, or certainly all of the major ones. And that includes the 7 states and the big ag districts and the big cities and reclamation and the International Boundary and Water Commission, et cetera. And this gets into Colorado River management that's broader than just the Delta, but in 2002 there was a very, very dry year where in the full basin where I think inflows to the big reservoirs were about 25% of the quote-unquote average long-term flow. And people began to wake up to a big drought event. Reservoir levels in maybe 3 or 4 years plummeted to 50% of capacity from having been basically full and spilling for many years. And reclamation pushed the lower basin states into discussions over sharing shortages. There's some general language in the quote-unquote law of the river that talks about shortage management and some general priorities that are expressed between the states, but there weren't really agreed to rules for implementation. And in the process of that, which was a big NEPA process, a full EIS where a variety of alternatives were considered, several NGOs worked together to draft an alternative for reclamation to evaluate in their work on coming up with a policy. And that was basically the first time that it certainly in anything that any history that I know about in the Colorado River basin that NGOs have sort of elevated a proposal to such a high profile. And while we certainly, and our proposal was called Conservation Before Shortage, and while it did not get adopted in full by any stretch of the imagination, there was a critical piece of our proposal that we thought really was our bottom line for making some progress in the Delta, and that was that the lower basin states were talking about the ability to bank water on a multi-year basis in Lake Mead. Mm-hmm. And we thought that maybe they should open that discussion to Mexico as well. And of course, the EIS was a domestic policy document, and really opening the door to something like that with Mexico had to happen through diplomatic channels. But Reclamation decided to go ahead and do the analysis for management that would include volumes of water that someone else, perhaps Mexico, would store in the reservoir, so that if diplomatic decisions were made subsequently, they wouldn't have to go back and revisit the decision on a domestic basis in the context of NEPA. So that provision was part of the final record of decision. Not allowing Mexico to bank water, because again, that's a diplomatic process, but actually clearing, basically opening the door for those discussions and clearing the NEPA hurdles for that discussion to happen ahead of time. And then in the wake of that, I'd say the sort of modern era of, or the modern phase of this work started the summer of 2007. It was actually before that record of decision was issued, but we were pretty sure we knew that that piece would get adopted because we knew that everybody was on board with it. We, meaning Peter Culp and myself, had met several times with some key water users in the U.S., including folks at the Arizona Department of Water Resources, Metropolitan Water District, and Southern Nevada Water Authority, and got them to come along with us to a meeting that we set up in Mexico with Oswald's help from Pronatura. I believe that Francisco Zamora from Sonoran Institute came along to the first meeting, and we had several former or retired water officials from Mexicali, from Conagua in the Mexicali region, and from Tijuana. And so this was a way to initiate a discussion on a binational basis about the possibilities for what improvements could be made regarding Colorado River management in the border context. And we had two meetings, I believe one in Tijuana and one in San Diego, maybe two in San Diego. At any rate, we brought this group together, and by the end of the summer, International Boundary and Water Commission had gotten wind of these meetings and issued a joint, I think it was a press release. I think at the end of the day, the press release was from Interior Secretary Kemp Thorne and Mexico Ambassador Sarukan. They released a joint press release saying that they wanted to sponsor binational discussions about Colorado River management, and that the International Boundary and Water Commission should be the official convener of these conversations. Mm-hmm. Which on the one hand felt a little bit like, well, we had started these conversations, and what were they doing, claiming that they were going to take them over, and was that really helpful? Because was it really helpful to have, Washington, D.C. and IBWC claiming such a prominent role? On the other hand, it gave some validity to the idea of the discussions and really allowed the discussions to take on a sort of life of their own, with a lot more buy-in to the potential of what they could achieve than I think they would have had in the long term if the NGOs had remained as the facilitators. And we have continued as a participant in these binational discussions, although occasionally some of the state stakeholders try to kick us out because they're just not because of anything we've done specifically at this table, but because they don't believe it's appropriate for nonprofits to be participating in these state-to-state and federal-to-federal discussions. Mm-hmm. But we have consistently been brought back in on both sides of the border because there are enough stakeholders who've seen that the ideas we're promoting have credibility, that we have come up with a construct for the U.S. and Mexico cooperating to restore pulse flows or flood flows to the delta that actually works for both countries within the legal framework and within taking into account concerns for water users and their rights. In a context of a set of binational discussions where there are a lot of other potential benefits to these water users on the table, so they see something they like there. So that's probably more than you wanted to hear.
No, actually, it's exactly what I wanted to hear. It's interesting to hear you talk about IBWC. It's always been thus. They like to be the official convener of anything that happens binationally, and it's interesting that you say they've lent some credibility. Have they limited your flexibility at all?
I think at times you can look at the discussions and say, well, all of a sudden there were a lot more people in the room, and sometimes, process takes on a bigger role when you have that agency in particular involved, but I'd say in general government's involved. But at the same time, I think we have made so much progress with their participation that at the end of the day, it's been a net benefit to have them involved.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, if we're going to have any kind of new minute to the treaty, they have to be bought in. Their names go on the dotted lines, and we need them in that way. And so, bringing them along from close to the beginning has probably been worth it. I would say that in all my experience with the International Boundary and Water Commission, it's very clear that they are, I perceive them as obstructionist and or foot dragging when it becomes clear, perhaps in hindsight, that they haven't really been invested in the process that they're working on. But when they actually want to achieve results, when they when whomever in the powers that be have declared or decided that there's an agency priority, they can actually be very helpful. Okay.
I wonder if we could unpack some of the ideas that have gone into this agreement. The sort of raising of funding to buy water by conservation groups, the decision of what Mexico should put in, those kinds of questions. How did those ideas evolve? I think the pulse...
So there's a few things that have happened. I'll try and be brief as I describe them.
You're doing...
One is that Pro Natura Noroeste established what's called the Water Trust for the Colorado River Delta.
Okay.
Which is an institution based in Mexico that legally can acquire water in the market, by paying for water, and then holds the water and deliver that water as long as the water remains within the Mexicali Irrigation District. They can legally deliver the water for ecological restoration projects. So that just got off the ground maybe 2 years ago, and it has, it's demonstrated at this point that it can receive donations from philanthropic interests. It can spend that money on water, secure the rights, work with Conagua, and get the water where it needs to go for restoration purposes. So that, I think, is one very important new component or piece of the solution. The other is a sort of sideline set of issues that emerged. There are a number of entities in the basin that are proponents of operating the Yuma desalting plant. I've been involved in talks about the Yuma desalting plant for many years. I'll just jump right to the most recent iteration, which was Southern Nevada Water Authority, Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and Central Arizona Project, or CAWCD, wanting to pay for the operation of the plant, or at least be a major cost share partners with Reclamation to do a pilot run to get the plant operating at 30% capacity for about a year. And if you're familiar with that plant and the old controversies over it,
I am.
It treats water that is present, has been running to the Cienega de Santa Clara,
right,
which is the biggest remaining wetland in the Delta. And, in the past, discussion about operating the Yuma desalting plant has prompted a vehement series of protests from environmental groups. However, because, as I said, this was only the latest iteration of many discussions that I've been a part of about operating the plant, and I was concerned at this point that simply saying no might not be enough, and we tried something a little different, which was, okay, if you need to operate the plant, then do it in a way that does no harm to the Cienega and replace the water at the Cienega. And this whole conversation, interestingly, the U.S. proponents of operating the plant really wanted to keep the domestic discussion about operating the plant separate from the already ongoing binational discussions that were, that Kemp Thorne and Sargon had announced as this big holistic reexamination of Colorado River management at the border. And here was the U.S. in some ways reverting to the old way of doing business somewhat unilaterally, making a decision domestically, doing a somewhat pro forma consultation with Mexico through the International Boundary and Water Commission outside of that binational discussion table. Mexico said they were not happy with that at the consultation meeting. I was not there, but they did bring Osvaldo Hinojosa there. And they suggested, that this was not going to be acceptable. And in the wake of that consultation meeting, we were able to use one of the many work groups that had been formed in the bigger binational discussions to hold a meeting on alternative water supply for the Cienega. And so we, without making any commitments, just had water managers from Mexico identifying potential replacement sources, and we had folks from the U.S. identifying potential replacement sources, and we had the Water Trust, the Corona Torres Water Trust, identifying potential replacement sources. And so we were able to put that together into a matrix and sort of define what the possibilities were, and that was taken back into the consultation process through IBWC and SELA, and the two countries agreed for this pilot run, which is just the 1-year operation of the plant, that they would each contribute some water to replace inflows of the Cienega that would be disrupted by operation of the Yuma desalting plant, and that the Water Trust would commit to replacing an equal part. So it's basically a three-way share with each entity, the U.S. federal government, the Mexican federal government, and the Water Trust, each providing 10,000 acre-feet of water to the Cienega. And I think that idea that the U.S. and Mexico could formally cooperate to do something for the environment, particularly to send water to an environmental resource in the Delta, that was basically unprecedented, and in my interpretation became a very influential idea for Mexico, because about a year later, when they came back with their first proposal to the U.S., really about what could be the substance of a new binational agreement for management of Colorado River flows at the border, I mean, they had things to say about water conservation and about binational desal projects. At the time, they didn't mention willingness to participate in Colorado River shortages, but that was sort of an unspoken understood and has since become integrated into the discussion. But what they said about the environment is, we would like to restore flows to the Colorado River Delta, and we'd like the Mexican government will commit a particular volume, and we want the U.S. to match us in that volume, and we want to be able to bank that water in Lake Mead and release it every few years as a big pulse flow all at once, so that we achieve that ecological benefit in the Delta. And I think, in my read of the situation, that the work that we did to restore flows or to protect flows to the Cienega during the pilot really set an example for how the two countries might cooperate in sending flows to the main stem of the Delta.
All right, I just want to be sure I got the timing correct here. This 30% operation of the Yuma desalting plant, did that occur?
That pilot started, I believe, in May of this year, and will run somewhere between 12 and 18 months. What they said is 365 days of operation over a period of up to 18 months, because they're anticipating there may be some plant outages.
And during that time, these flows that are denied to the Cienega have been supplied through the plan that you're talking about.
Yeah, actually, it's of course always a little more complicated, but the binational agreement to replace flows, I believe that was signed last fall, November or December. And in the terms of that agreement, replacement flows could be signed could be delivered anytime from the date the agreement was signed through the completion of the pilot.
Okay.
So in fact, the United States had already sent some of its replacement flows before operation of the plant started, and that's in part because the U.S. is replacing those flows by capturing, water flood flows, inadvertent flood flows on the Colorado River.
Which would have gone anyway,
so
maybe?
They wanted to have, right. Well, it basically would have gone to Morelos Dam, and in all likelihood would have been diverted into Mexico's irrigation system. So, it did occur to us at the time, are we somehow robbing Peter to pay Paul? But because of Mexico's history of diverting those flows, it didn't seem to, there was no certainty, there was certainly a low probability that those flows would actually reach the Delta habitat areas, so it seemed like a better, a firmer commitment to send it to the Cienega was worth it.
But if it's turned out to be a template for an agreement on these pulse flows, that's even a better thing, right?
Yeah, really, I don't think I fully appreciated at the time how this idea would resonate, particularly within the agencies in Mexico City that have been the lead on the binational negotiations, but having them come forward with that. So they essentially proposed for the main stem delta flows, not only did they say we want the U.S. and Mexico to cooperate in creating these pulse flows, but they also said at the same time, and the Water Trust is committed to providing base flows, which is in the mission statement of the Colorado River Delta Water Trust, which is to acquire enough water to provide the base flow in the Delta. And there has for a long time been discussion about the need for both a base flow and an occasional pulse flow. So they went right for that three-way share again.
Okay. One thing that we haven't fleshed out here is sort of your relationship with researchers at the University of Arizona, like Carl Flessa, and other people who began to help you quantify this. Could you help us fill that in a little bit?
Sure. I have been a fan of Carl's work for years, starting with his work on the Colorado River Delta clam and the sediments that he was picking up in the upper Gulf, and have actually had one of his grad students as an intern here one summer. So I've known him and his work for quite a while. in his most recent, what he's doing right now is monitoring the impacts of the operation of the Yuma desalting plant during the pilot run, and the water, the agencies that are the cost share agencies that are the proponents of operating the plant, that's CAP, MET, and Southern Nevada Water Authority, they, long before we were talking about replacement supply of water for the Cienega, they said, well, we're going to have this pilot run of the plant, and we want to have a Cadillac monitoring plant so we can really see what impact the plant's operation has on the Cienega. And from our sort of political negotiating standpoint, we didn't think that testing how much degradation you can impose on the Cienega was a great idea. And so we really pushed for replacement water, and I wouldn't say it in any way that that's mutually exclusive of a monitoring program, but certainly from the water provider's perspective, it maybe diminished the opportunity that they saw to see what you could get away with in terms of impacting the water inflows at the Cienega. So it's been an interesting learning experience for the NGOs and for Carl leading that monitoring program to sort of work through, messaging and what's the priority, what are we telling the water user community here. But we've made it through. And so that's just been an interesting new twist on how we've worked together. Ed Glenn, for many years, was sort of the voice of ecological resources in the Delta. He's not been as prolific lately, and I don't know if that's because he's just working less, and I know he has a grandchild. But he really did some of the early work in bringing attention to the resources, the ecological resources that are in the Delta, and he also was the first one who put his finger on or made an attempt to quantify how much water the Delta needs and helped us make that very modest proposal that I was discussing earlier in the interview. And those are really principally the two that I've
So Jennifer,
worked with at U of A.
This is Gwynn. I have a question. It seems to me that a lot of things came together for all of you. There was sort of a zeitgeist or a sort of timing. But one of the things that I'm also hearing is that there were particular people that made that feasible, and that there was shifts that institutions were making, particularly IBWC, CELA. Can you maybe talk to that a little bit as well?
Sure. I don't know. I mean, I would say that the shift at IBWC, well, yeah, people do make a difference. So, in the NGO community, Oswald has just been a good friend for many years, and the fact that he's been around working on these issues for about as long as I have has been critical. And like I said earlier, we really have learned a lot of what we're doing together. Critical to the fact that we are both still working on Colorado River Delta restoration. I think you cannot leave out the support of some foundations that have really kept, and I won't speak for Pro Natura, but I'll speak for Environmental Defense Fund. If we hadn't had support, and I'll name them, it's the Walton Family Foundation, and the particular interest from and support of Sam Walton, I don't think we would be doing this. We wouldn't have been able to sustain this work for so long, because really for many years, very few foundations were supporting Colorado River conservation work, certainly in the lower basin and the Delta. So that's made a huge difference. So turning over to IBWC, I worked with a succession of commissioners. There was a horrible plane crash that you may know about.
Yeah, I do. Herrera
and Marin.
Right.
In the same plane. I want to say it was 2 years ago, September. So it would have been 2008. And that was a tremendous loss of momentum.
Arturo was really a visionary person.
He was, and at the same time, I would say that some new ideas have come out of Mexico. As new leadership has been able to emerge there. And he really was visionary, and yet he had, he had been there for 18 years, I think.
Long time.
And that, it has been helpful as, his vision was always helpful, and I always considered him a true friend of what we've been trying to work on. And at the same time, I'd say that some shift in perspective and some new people being able to let go of some things that sort of he always held to be true has helped this process along as well from my perspective.
As long as we're on this subject, if it's okay with you, Gwynn, can we talk a little bit about working with people in Mexico and what has facilitated that? We talked to Catalina Denman, who's you may not know. She works in public health.
No.
And she's pretty skeptical about U.S. Mexico networks and partnerships, saying there's just a basic difference in interest. Yet, in many of the people we've talked to, their long experience, maybe with graduate work in the United States, they're working for U.S. NGOs, then returning and working in Mexican government. There seems to be a very close collaboration, which doesn't sound very much like this basic problem that people have with trust. Could you speak a little bit to your experience?
I feel like I have, had a tremendous learning curve in working with organizations on the ground in Mexico, and maybe my most fundamental principle is, they are there, and this is their place that we're talking about, and I will always defer to them on what makes the most sense, both in terms of outcomes and also in terms of strategies when they have a particular perspective on something, because they will always be able to see that more clearly than I can. And then the other thing is, maybe what this other person has been, I can see there were days 10 years ago, there was a time when the funding was very unequal, where some of the U.S. groups had access to some big U.S. funders and, had people in paid positions, and some of the Mexican groups were just barely able to eke out a salary for a very low-paid staffer, and some of that has changed, so that certainly with the folks I'm working with, they have the kind of financial and institutional support that I have. And so there's not that inequality in, that perceived between us, and there's not that kind of inequality between the institutions that we work for. And I think that has made a difference. And certainly, I like to think of myself as like I'm these people's friends, and that, and they are my friends, and it would never matter what happens around us in terms of that kind of support. But I'm sure that it does, and I'm not. I don't want to pretend that it doesn't. So I think it's been very helpful to have the Mexican NGOs, some of these Mexican NGOs supported at a level that really has given them great capacity.
Other people have mentioned that, incidentally. Yeah.
So I think that we do. In the institution of Pornator and Noroeste, and in the person of Osvaldo Hinojosa, I have found a tremendous partnership. And working with Carlos de la Parra, who of course is my consultant, but is lives in Mexico, works in Mexico, I've just had, and has been able to help me and help Pro Natura. He works with Pro Natura as much as he works with EDF. We've just developed a tremendous working team. And it helps that we're very focused on one, admittedly very difficult to achieve objective that's taking us a really long time, but it's not like we're constantly searching for the next thing to work on together. We are very, we are aligned because of this shared purpose. And it's very clear why Pro Natura Noroeste has a role and why a group like EDF has a role, because what we're trying to do is something that involves big, governmental systems and physical systems and ecological systems and economic systems in the whole Colorado River Basin. So I think having those roles, clear roles for what we're trying to do and how we're working together is also helpful.
What you say reminds me to ask you, a few people we've talked to make a kind of distinction between place-based non-governmental organizations like Friends of the Santa Cruz, although this is not something that Sherry Sass said, and perhaps you don't even know about the organization, but sort of place-based organizations where you talk about they are the actual people who are there, and large-scale national organizations, and everyone always makes an exception of you. They say, well, not Jennifer. But there is a tendency for big organizations to come in and to sort of make deals or reap the benefits of deals without being sensitive to the consequences on the ground. Have you a comment about that?
And I'm certainly not, that's not news to my ears. So
I'm sure not.
Think of Big Green that way sometimes. But I think it's been very helpful that since day one at Environmental Defense Fund, my mission has been place-based. And it's, where I say crap flows downstream, so the whole basin has become interesting to me because it all impacts what happens in the Delta. So I've had plenty of opportunities to think about policy in the basin, but it's always done with this lens of what does it mean for the Delta. And so I've had that place orientation.
Great.
So maybe that's one, I am not the Western Water Program at Environmental Defense Fund, and I'm not the, water policy expert for everything. I am the person who works on the Colorado River Delta, and just in the last 2 years have increased my focus really to thinking about protection and restoration of environmental flows throughout the Colorado River Basin. But I've always been so place-focused in my job description here that I think that has helped.
That's really very, very helpful.
And it helps, too, it may help that Environmental Defense Fund puts the vast majority of its resources into controlling global warming pollution and working on climate change policy. And our big offices are in New York and D.C., and they don't know anything about what I'm doing out here. I mean, they only know the tiniest bit. And so I've generally been able to work fairly independently under the radar screen. To some extent, I have to be able to describe the work I'm doing in a way that fits into bigger organizational objectives, but nobody's ever handed up some policy decision to me and said, you have to work with this.
That's really helpful. I'm glad I asked the question. So now I'll ask the other question. Having spent a lifetime observing water buffaloes, I have to say that I'm in great admiration with your ability to work with institutions that I would have thought could never do what you've managed to get them to do. Can you talk a little bit, is it a change of personnel? Is it a recognition of some physical change due to the drought? How do you explain the Salt River Project and the Central Arizona Project?
I wouldn't say I know the guys at SRP so much, but I do know a crew at the Central Arizona Water Conservation District, the folks who run the CAP.
Yeah.
So partly it's that I've just stuck with this for a really long time, and so people know me, and I've been pretty consistent, and I haven't litigated, and I think I've made a reputation for myself as solutions-oriented and a bridge builder, so that people do talk to me, and I don't know if they listen to me all that much, but at least they're willing to sit down and talk with me. But so that's part of it, is just I've stuck around, for better or worse. I would say that the drought, ironically, I mean, there's less water to go around. You'd think, why would environmental, management for environmental restoration be gaining traction in a time when it appears that there's just less water for anything? But I'd say one of the biggest challenges of Colorado River management is that, ability to dig your heels in and fight for the quote-unquote law of the river as an inflexible legal and institutional framework. But the fact of the drought, the fact that the demand line for water use on the river now basically exceeds the supply line, and the fact that we as a community are forced to confront climate change and some pretty clear projections that that's going to further decrease water available in the basin, it means that something's got to give. And so if something's got to give, there has to be some change in this institutional and legal framework. And as we look for the solutions there and look to find flexibility that doesn't, the way I have worked and the way I see many of the water managers in the basin work is not, it's rare they hear anybody saying they want to overturn the compact or, get rid of the foundation upon all of which this is built, even though sometimes it feels like, the biggest headache in my life. Where was I going with this?
You're talking about what sort of...
It basically, it's the flexibility. It means that there seems to be a broad recognition at this point, not just from the environmental community, but broadly from the federal government, from state governments, from water managers at the big regional wholesalers, that something has to give, that we need new flexibilities in order to get through.
Do you think they need the environmental community more than they used to think they needed it?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
But I think that as long as we come saying, here, we have a solution that we think will help you with your needs and at the same time will help help avoid future listings in the river, or help, let's not even go to the ESA, but just increase ecological resiliency in the river because we're protecting environmental flows, they'll at least, sit down for that conversation with us. I can't say that we'll succeed, but in the case of the Delta, push came to shove because the lower basin states, even if they don't physically really need Mexico to take a shortage, because Mexico's shortage volume, when you look at what it does to Lake Mead, water elevations is pretty inconsequential. It's tiny. But politically, they need Mexico to be taking a shortage, because then they can say, well, we're having a shortage here in Arizona. We got Mexico to take a shortage too, and that's something they can demonstrate that they've done to their publics. They needed that, and in order to make that happen, they needed Mexico to voluntarily sign on the dotted line, and that's really part of the fundamental dynamic that has made this binational negotiation possible. So that is a place where, coming up against the wall of water shortages has opened the door to new solutions being possible.
That's great. One other question that's critical for us, and that is this sort of poisoned atmosphere related to border security, immigration, drugs, which, this is the week that our Arizona Act comes online.
Yes.
Has that had an impact on what you've been trying to do?
I would say that generally that Arizona statute has principally been the subject of snickering and jokes that, that people, mostly are just rolling their eyes at it. In the context, and this is only in the context of water management, water managers, water users, those meetings. I do know that at least there was a meeting I was going to try to get to of the monitoring team at the Cienega de Santa Clara, and they originally, I think, had planned to have that meeting in Yuma, and they moved it over to El Centro or somewhere, Calexico, somewhere, so that they didn't have to have it in Arizona. So because I don't think folks from Mexico really want to go to Arizona right now. So there's a sensitivity to it. I think I would say that from the current administration at Interior, I see a very, I see strong signals that they would like to have a positive message, and they would like to see a good outcome from these binational negotiations, or that they'd like to have a good story to tell about the U.S. and Mexico working together on water management for mutual benefit. And that may be, I think there's a number of reasons why this administration wants that. I remember a year ago, Hillary Clinton going down to Mexico City with a bit of a mea culpa on the whole drug issue. And so I think this administration is trying to at least change the spin on how they deal across the U.S. Mexico border.
And have you... go ahead.
The fence it has sort of briefly been an issue. The water is... They can't fence off the river. We've already basically fenced the river in a way, but the fence itself will not prevent us from the restoration work that we're interested in doing, because they won't be blocking flows in the river channel with a fence anytime. At least I haven't heard of any proposals to do that. The fence that has been built along the binational reach of the river goes up on the levee, so it actually almost, it's funny because I think of it almost as feeding the U.S. portion of habitat on that binational reach to Mexico. Not really. They're not letting Mexico over there, but they fenced it off from the Yuma and Somerton community. So it's a kind of a funny situation there. But I do think that there's, we've had some conversations with the Border Patrol where they're saying the salt cedar is so thick, and my goodness, if you could do restoration and have some limited stands of the big cottonwood trees, but then generally a lower vegetation layer of natives, that would be better for them from a monitoring perspective. And I know that, or I believe that Pronatura has had conversations with landowners on the Mexican side of the binational reach of river, where they are interested, the community is interested in restoration, because they don't like that control of the area has basically been lost to the narcotraficantes, and that they would prefer to have sort of a management presence there so that it is not a dangerous area. I don't know if ecological restoration ultimately can deliver that, but I know that community is very supportive, has been very supportive of restoring natural habitat along the river there, with that as one of their justifications.
And have you had, has the cocoa paw played a role in any of this as well, or the...
They have, and I have for years. I would go down there and talk to them. They had a real initiative for a while trying to work on habitat restoration, but they have had a sort of fraught, that's not the right word, they haven't necessarily wanted to address the water issue head on because of the tribal reserved water rights and the way that the relationship between the federal government and the tribes has evolved over water rights has not always been an easy one, and so they really wanted to talk about restoration without necessarily addressing water head on. their efforts, the COCOPA's efforts, really got channeled into a project with National Wildlife Federation, where I think NWF succeeded in helping them to raise money for an on-the-ground, like, pole planting restoration project. And my understanding is it was not an irrigated project, and I can't tell you how successful it was because I haven't been down there. So they are clearly a critical player given where they are located, but from my perspective, where I've been working on the flows, they haven't been a critical player.
Okay, terrific. Helen?
I think, I think we're good. We've taken our hour.
Great.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Sure thing, and I hope it's sort of remotely interesting indoor health.
Oh, no, it's been very, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Okay.
We'll be in touch.
Good luck with your project. Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
bye, Jennifer.
Bye-bye.